Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be tackling an idea that might sound a bit intimidating at first, but stick with us. We're going to try to break it down.
Yeah.
So,
Fun one.
yeah, it is. It's the Nomos of the Earth. So have you ever heard of this idea?
I have heard of it. It's a big one for sure.
Yeah.
A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, it is. And it sounds very academic.
Yeah,
But we're going to try to make it as approachable as possible.
absolutely.
And hopefully show why it's relevant to how we understand global politics, even today.
Yeah.
And we're going to explore how this idea, nomos of the earth, has shaped international law and the idea of global order throughout history.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that sounds very abstract,
Yeah.
but it's really about the concrete ways that human beings have organized themselves on the planet.
Yeah.
So it's a journey that takes us from ancient Greece all the way to the 21st century. It gets at the heart of how humanity has tried to create order in a world that can feel very chaotic.
Right, exactly. And our main guide on this journey is Carl Schmitt. He was a German legal scholar who wrote a book called The Nomos of the Earth in the International Law of the Jus Publicum Europaeum. So,
Yeah, a mouthful.
yeah, it is a mouthful, yeah. Now,
It's a serious book,
Schmitt is a controversial figure, that's for sure.
for sure.
But his insights are thought-provoking. What do you say?
Absolutely. Schmidt's one of those thinkers you can never quite pin down,
Right.
which makes him really interesting to grapple with.
Yeah. And his core idea is that international law isn't just about rules written down
Yeah.
on paper.
Right.
It's much more than that. It's about how we physically organized ourselves on Earth.
Hmm.
He argues that throughout history there have been different nomos, different ways of dividing and ordering the world.
Yeah. It's not just abstract rules, right?
Right.
It's about concrete spatial appropriation
Yes.
and the creation of order. And this act of ordering, it has a material component to it.
Right.
It's about who controls what territory, who gets to decide how resources are used,
Right.
all those things.
And who's in and who's out.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's about more than just laws. It's about power,
Yeah.
territory, and who gets to decide how the world is structured. That sounds pretty relevant to today's world. I don't know. What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the conflicts we see today over things like borders, trade routes, control of resources.
Yeah.
These are all about nomos.
Yeah.
Even if we don't always use that word.
Right. Yeah. So Schmitt identifies 3 broad stages of nomos. And the first stage goes all the way back to ancient empires.
Okay.
So,
Way back.
yeah, way back. Think ancient Rome, for example.
Okay.
They had their own legal system, their own culture,
Yeah.
their own way of life.
Sure.
But beyond their borders,
Mm-hmm.
they saw what they perceived as chaos.
Right. They had this idea of the barbarians,
Right.
the people outside of their civilization,
Right, exactly.
who didn't follow their laws, their customs.
Right, so this is other...
Exactly. The other, the unknown, the potentially dangerous.
You're right. And they developed this concept called justus hostis. So
Justus hostis.
yeah, the just enemy.
Okay.
So this is a big one. This wasn't just about who they could fight. This
Right.
was a way of defining who belonged within their legal and spatial order and who was outside of it.
It's about defining the boundaries of their world, both literally and figuratively.
So it's like drawing a line in the sand, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
You're either part of the Roman world or you're in the chaos beyond.
Precisely. And Schmitt argues that this idea of creating order by separating yourself from chaos
Yeah.
is a recurring theme throughout history.
Right. But things start to shift dramatically with the second stage of nomos.
Okay, so what changes?
Well, this is where Europe enters the picture.
You're
In a
right.
big way, yeah.
Makes sense.
After the discovery of the New World, European powers started dividing up the globe.
Right. This is the age of exploration, colonialism.
Yes, exactly.
Big changes on the horizon.
Yeah, big time. And this is where we encounter a concept that might seem strange to us today.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Amity lines.
Amity lines.
Yeah. So imagine Spain and Portugal,
Okay.
both major naval powers at the time,
Right.
drawing a line down the Atlantic Ocean.
So they're literally drawing lines on a map
Yes.
and saying, okay, we can fight over territory west of this line, but not east of it.
That's essentially it, yeah. It's wild, right?
It is kind of wild when you think about it. Like they just decided to carve up the world between themselves.
Yeah, and these Amity lines were often driven by religious conflicts.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was a way for European powers to manage their rivalries and
Mm.
avoid all-out war. So even though they were competing for territory and power,
Right.
they still needed some kind of order.
They needed some kind of agreement on how to divide up the spoils, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's like a strange kind of cooperation built on top of competition.
Yes, exactly. And the second stage is also crucial because it marks the emergence of a key distinction:
What's that?
the division between land and sea.
Ah, land versus sea.
Yes. Land gets carved up into sovereign territories,
Okay.
but the sea is declared free for all.
Free for all, huh?
Yeah.
But wouldn't that lead to conflicts? I mean, everyone wants access to the sea for trade, exploration.
That's a great question. And you're absolutely right, it did lead to conflicts.
I can imagine.
This tension between the free sea and the desire for control over maritime routes
Right.
played a major role in shaping international law.
Makes sense.
It's also closely tied to the rise of concepts like free trade
Okay.
and a balance of power between European states.
So European expansion and the division of the world had a huge impact on the development of international law as we know it.
Without a doubt. And this particular order that was established by European powers after the discovery of the New World had a name:
It did. What was it?
just Publicum Europaeum.
Jus Publicum Europaeum. That's a mouthful. Could you break that down for us a little?
It literally translates to European public law. Essentially, it was the set of rules, norms, and principles that govern relations between European states and their interactions with the rest of the world.
So it's like the operating system for global politics.
Yes. Yes.
During that period,
Yeah.
everything else was built on top of it.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. But as you might imagine, this European-centric order wouldn't last forever.
Right, because eventually European dominance started to decline.
Right. And the world became a much more complicated place.
More players on the stage,
Yeah.
new ideas, new challenges.
Exactly, yeah. And this is where Schmidt's third stage of Nomos comes in.
Okay, the third stage.
Yeah. He argued that in the 20th century, we saw a shift toward a more universal form of international law.
So instead of just European powers calling the shots, there's an attempt to create a system
Yes.
that applies to everyone equally, at least in theory.
That was the ideal, at
Yeah.
least. But as Schmidt points out, it's much easier said than done.
Way easier said than done.
Right.
I mean, think about it. You've got all these different countries with different histories, different cultures, different interests.
Yeah.
How do you get them all to agree on one set of rules?
Yeah, and he was particularly critical of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was the first major attempt to create a truly global organization for maintaining peace.
So a noble goal.
Right, a noble goal, yeah.
Maybe a bit too ambitious for its time.
So he wasn't exactly optimistic about the future of international law, was he?
Well, he was a complex thinker, right? I mean, he saw both the potential and the pitfalls of this move towards a more universal system.
So what were the pitfalls in his view?
He saw the League of Nations as ultimately failing to create a lasting global order.
Okay.
And he believed this failure was connected to a lack of a clear spatial foundation
Interesting.
for this new universal law.
So what you're saying is that even though the world was becoming more interconnected,
There wasn't a shared understanding of how it should be divided and ordered.
that's a great way to put it. And I think that tension between the desire for a universal system of law
Yeah.
and the realities of power, territory, and competing interests,
Right.
that's something we still grapple with today.
It sounds like it. And it definitely sounds like Schmidt's ideas are still relevant to understanding the challenges facing
Oh, for sure.
international organizations and global governance today. But before we get too far into the present,
Yeah.
let's dive a bit deeper into some of the key thinkers and concepts that shaped this,
Yeah.
this Jus Publicum Europaeum, this European world order that had such a lasting impact.
Right, because to understand where we are today, we need to understand where we came from.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And one figure who really wrestled with the ethical and legal dilemmas of this period was Francisco de Vitoria.
Vittoria, now, he was a theologian, right? Not a lawyer.
He was a theologian, yeah.
What does he have to do with international law?
That's what makes him so interesting. Okay, tell me more.
He was a 16th century Spanish theologian,
Okay.
and he was deeply concerned about the ethics of the Spanish conquest of the Americas.
Ah, I see. So he was grappling with the moral implications of colonialism.
Exactly. I mean, you can imagine the kinds of questions he was asking.
Yeah, like how do you justify taking land from people who've been living there for centuries?
Right. And what are the limits of conquest? Can you just claim any territory you discover?
It's a moral minefield.
Yeah, totally. And what's remarkable is that Victoria, even back then, argued that simple discovery wasn't enough to justify taking land from indigenous peoples.
So he was challenging the very basis of European colonialism. That's pretty radical for the 16th century.
It was a groundbreaking stance, and he recognized that they had rights,
Right.
even if those rights weren't fully understood or respected at the time.
So he's planting the seeds for a more inclusive understanding of international law.
He is. But of course, there were still limitations to his thinking. He still relied on ideas like papal authority and just war doctrine to justify certain aspects of the conquest.
Okay, so it's not like he was a modern-day human rights activist.
Like, he was a product of his time.
But he was wrestling with some big questions.
He was. The clash between European expansion and the rights of indigenous peoples,
Yeah.
the desire for order, the realities of conquest.
And Vittoria's work highlights a crucial turning point, don't you think?
It does, yeah.
This growing awareness that a new global order required new ethical and legal frameworks.
Right, we're starting to see the seeds of modern international law being sown,
Yeah.
even amidst the chaos and violence of colonial expansion.
Precisely. And as we'll see, this tension between power,
Right.
order, and the search for a more just and equitable world
Yeah.
that continues to shape the nomos of the earth even today.
Okay, so we've established that Vittoria was a pretty progressive thinker for his time, raising some uncomfortable questions about the ethics of colonialism. But what about other thinkers who shaped the development of international law?
Well, Vittoria's ideas sparked a whole wave of intellectual debate, and we could spend hours talking about all the fascinating figures who contributed to this evolving understanding of international order.
Oh, yeah.
But a few names really stand out.
Like who? Give us the highlight reel.
There's Hugo Grotius, often called the father of international law.
Okay.
He really tried to systematize the rules governing war and peace between nations, building on some of the ideas Vittoria had put forward.
So he was trying to create a more predictable and, dare I say, civilized framework for how states interact with each other.
Exactly. He emphasized the importance of treaties, diplomacy, and a system of rules that applied to all states regardless of their religion or political system.
That sounds like a pretty ambitious project for his time. Did his ideas actually catch on?
They certainly had a lasting impact. Then you have Emer de Vattel, a Swiss jurist, who built on Grotius's work and focused on the idea of state sovereignty. He argued that each state had the right to govern itself without interference from others.
That sounds like a key principle of modern international law, but I imagine it was also quite controversial at the time, especially given all the colonial empires running around.
Oh, absolutely. The idea that all states, even newly independent ones, should have equal sovereignty was a radical departure from the old colonial order.
And then, of course, there's Immanuel Kant, the philosophical heavyweight. I know he wrote about international relations too, right?
He did. Kant envisioned a world where states would cooperate with each other based on shared principles of reason and morality. He believed that this cooperation was the key to achieving lasting peace.
So we're seeing a gradual shift from a world dominated by brute force and conquest to one where ideas like international law, diplomacy, and cooperation start to gain traction.
That's a great way to summarize it. But this shift wasn't just about abstract ideas. It was also deeply intertwined with how states were recognizing each other and interacting on the global stage.
Recognition. You mentioned that earlier, and it sounds like a deceptively simple concept that actually has a lot of weight in international affairs.
It absolutely does. Recognizing a state or a government is essentially a way of saying, we acknowledge your right to exist and to participate in the international system.
It's like giving a country a diplomatic stamp of approval. But it's not always that straightforward, is it?
Not at all. Schmidt brings up a fascinating example, the American Civil War. When European powers recognized the Confederacy, it actually challenged U.S. sovereignty.
Wow. So by recognizing a breakaway state, they were essentially undermining the authority of the existing government.
Precisely. It shows how recognition, or the withholding of it, can be a powerful tool in international politics. The U.S. later adopted this tactic with the Stimson Doctrine, refusing to recognize territories acquired through aggression.
So it's like turning the tables on the old colonial powers, using recognition as a way to enforce a certain kind of international order.
Exactly. But it also highlights the ongoing tension between powerful states trying to impose their vision of Nomos and the desire for a more equitable and just global system.
And we see this tension play out in other ways too, right? Like with the Estrada Doctrine. I remember reading about that in one of the articles you sent me.
Ah, yes. The Estrada Doctrine was a Latin American response to interventionism. Instead of picking sides in other countries' conflicts, they essentially said, we're not getting involved in the whole recognition game.
So they were trying to chart a middle course, avoiding entanglement in other countries' affairs.
Precisely. It was a bold attempt to limit the interference of powerful states in their internal affairs, although its effectiveness is debatable.
But it's a fascinating example of how different countries try to navigate the complexities of this evolving nomos, this global order that was constantly in flux.
Absolutely. And as we move further into the 20th century, we see how technological advancements started to disrupt this order in profound ways.
Right. We can't talk about the nomos of the earth without considering how war and technology have reshaped it, especially in the modern era. I'm particularly interested in what Schmidt has to say about this.
Well, Schmidt was very concerned with how new technologies, especially the airplane, completely upended traditional distinctions between land and sea warfare.
I can see why that would be a problem. Suddenly, the neat lines between a free sea and sovereign territories become much more blurred.
Exactly. And this blurring had devastating consequences, leading to more destructive conflicts and the rise of total war.
Total war. What does he mean by that?
Schmidt argues that total war essentially eroded the legal constraints on violence that had been so carefully constructed over centuries.
So instead of wars being fought between armies on defined battlefields, entire societies become involved, and the lines between combatants and civilians become blurred.
Precisely. And this blurring, Schmidt argues, had a profound impact on the very idea of justus hostis, the just enemy.
Because if everyone's a potential target, then the old rules of engagement no longer apply.
Exactly. And this raises some deeply unsettling questions. Can there even be such a thing as a just war in the age of total war? What happens to international law when the very foundations of order and restraint are eroded?
It's almost like we're back to that ancient Greek idea of chaos encroaching on the ordered world, but on a global scale.
Schmidt certainly seems to think so. He's particularly critical of attempts to criminalize war itself, arguing that it's ultimately a political problem, not a legal one.
So instead of trying to outlaw war, he's saying we need to focus on creating a more stable and just international order that reduces the likelihood of conflict in the first place.
That's one way to interpret his argument. But he also seems to be suggesting that there are inherent limits to what international law can achieve, especially in a world where power and technology are constantly shifting.
It's a sobering thought, but one that we need to grapple with. Because if we're going to build a more peaceful and sustainable world, we need to understand the forces that drive conflict and the limitations of our current systems.
I completely agree. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about Schmidt's work. Even if you disagree with his conclusions, it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, order, and the fragility of international law.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from ancient empires to the rise of total war and all this stuff about nomos. But as we wrap up this deep dive into the nomos of the earth, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be mulling over as they go about their day?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that international law, it's not static. It's not just a set of rules carved in stone. It's a constantly evolving reflection of how we understand and organize ourselves on this planet.
And that organization, this nomos, it's always about more than just rules on paper, right?
Right.
It's about concrete actions, spatial divisions, and the struggle for power, as we've seen throughout history.
Exactly. It's about who gets to decide how the world is ordered, who benefits from that order, and who's left out.
And as we navigate the complexities of the 21st century with its new technologies, global challenges, and shifting power dynamics, we need to be mindful of how our actions are shaping the nomos of the earth, whether we're aware of it or not.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, the future of international law, and really the future of our planet, depends on the choices we make today.
It's a sobering thought, but also empowering in a way. Don't you think? I mean, we're not just passive observers of history. We're active participants in shaping the nomos for future generations.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it highlights the importance of understanding these concepts even if they seem abstract or academic at first glance. I mean, they have real-world implications for how we approach everything from climate change to cybersecurity to international conflict.
So if you're intrigued by these questions of global order, power, and the future of international law, where would you suggest our listeners go from here?
Well, I'd encourage them to explore the works of Carl Schmitt, even if they don't agree with everything he says. His analysis is incredibly insightful and thought-provoking. There are also countless resources available on the history of international law, from academic journals to online courses to podcasts like this one.
And if you're feeling really adventurous, you could pick a specific region of the world and trace how its spatial and legal order has evolved over time.
Oh, that's a great idea. You could look at how borders have shifted, how treaties have been negotiated, how different cultures and legal systems have interacted. It's a journey of discovery that can really deepen your understanding of the nomos of the earth.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, keep those brain gears turning, explore these ideas, challenge your assumptions, and engage in the ongoing conversation about how we shape a more just and sustainable global order.
And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to come up with a groundbreaking idea for a new nomos that meets the challenges of the 21st century.
That's what we need. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did.